Hello, church. This is talk number 3, last P of alliteration, partnership in buildings. The experiential question we ask that a lot of us do is, how do we keep going? We ask questions like, how do we get enough volunteers and how do we pay the pastor? But now we're talking about what's the energy we have to maintain the building. But what is a more sustainability with vitality perspective to our buildings? This is important not just for the local church, but our culture as well. Our culture is wondering about our buildings and not just for condo conversions. A recent article on the CBC asked this question: why Canada's 27,000 faith buildings are crucial for communities. Another article here on faith and the common good, which purports to talk about an in-depth look into loss of community infrastructure because of the closing of faith buildings. So what is a more sustainability with vitality perspective to our buildings? Well, our buildings, our culture knows this, are critical community spaces. While every commercial and home value dollar is being squeezed from every square inch of real estate, church buildings often sit empty while being at the physical center of many communities. They are critical community spaces. University of Toronto has a website called thehaloproject.ca in which they talk about the real financial value to communities of $4.77 per $1 of church budget. Churches are community spaces, but also community supporting spaces. They're places where there can be often where 12-step programs are happening, where food and clothing banks occur, where there's blood donor clinics, arts groups, kids camps, and meeting points. As commercial rentals become so expensive, they are critical to important things that support our community. But they can also be a place that bless small businesses, exercise groups, tutoring, art shows, pop-up stores, counselor, office space, thrift stores. That's one of the things we did as Crosstown Church. So what are some of the things to consider as we kind of think about sustainability with vitality along with our culture? Here's a question. If we're to begin sharing our space, how do we also intentionally share our faith? An important part of this way of thinking is, how are we more present ourselves when people are renting? How can we show great hospitality? Are there things that they could take home with them that might point them towards Christ and the ministry of our community? Our focus and mission is not always to get people in our building, but if they're there, how do we think about sharing our faith? Secondly, what is the blend we want to consider of what we do in the building that's community supporting and perhaps often free, and business building? How do we balance income and vision to bless our neighbors? These are important considerations. Certainly, one of the things to use our space for is to host a church plant that might reach a different demographic, right? Sustainability with vitality. Now, if we want to see this managed, there's a few things to consider, perhaps more than this list. But the first thing that we might consider, especially as we're dealing with a shortage of volunteers, could we hire someone or pay someone into an incentivized role in which they would get paid more the more the building is rented? That would bless the church and, of course, bless someone with a job. Part of the consideration there is setting aside some of the income to increase, maybe improve, or even keep up to date with the maintenance of the building. Another thing to consider is the question about human rights principles. There's certain realities that churches don't have to always align themselves with when renting their space, but that will become more and more critical as we open up our building to all kinds of different groups. And just think about what that means to us to be people of hospitality to everyone. One of the last things to consider is that's happening in a number of places, that the churches actually sell their building to an organization. I can share with you what some possible organizations, and then they rent it back. This helps to get around the human rights principles question, because then those organizations would, of course, have to be fully open like any other space. But then they can also freely rent to us who may have more conservative views on things. So our final discussion, the last 2 questions are this: what takeaways do you have from this evening, maybe this last talk? And secondly, what follow-up might be helpful for you and your